It was one of those afternoons that seems completely innocent. You know the type. Soft spring warmth. Sunlight flashing across the water. Birds loud enough to notice, but not loud enough to ruin the mood. The kind of day where nothing bad is supposed to happen, which is usually when something absolutely does. I live along a narrow strip of waterfront. Nothing extravagant. No mansion, no luxury retreat. Just a modest home with a small private dock that's been there longer than most of the people who suddenly have opinions about it. That dock isn't for show. It's not a community amenity. It's practical, regulated, and painfully official. And yes, it sits right on my property line, properly surveyed, legally documented, and very deliberately excluded from the HOA's jurisdiction map. But logic has never been a prized skill in this neighborhood. That's when I noticed her. A woman I'd only ever seen at a distance before. Mid-50s, posture stiff as a board, haircut that practically shouted, "I demand to speak to management for sport," standing on my dock like she owned it. She had a clipboard tucked under her arm and a giant red and white NO trespassing sign bolted straight into the wood. New screws, clean edges, confident placement. I remember squinting at it from my truck and thinking, that's new. Then half a second later it hit me. Hold on, why is there a sign on my dock? I pulled over and stepped out, and before I could even open my mouth, she started talking. Not to me, to the neighbors. She was holding court like she was auditioning for a courtroom drama nobody ordered, pointing at the water, gesturing at the dock, lecturing about violations, compliance, community safety, and my personal favorite, authority. Every sentence sounded practiced, like she rehearsed it in the mirror. This was Marlene. Not her real name, obviously, but if you've ever lived near an HOA, you've met a Marlene. She wasn't elected to anything that mattered. She wasn't trained in anything useful, but she carried herself like a self-appointed sheriff of suburbia. And that afternoon, she'd apparently decided my dock was her new frontier. What she didn't know was this. The dock isn't just private property. It's a designated operational access point. It's used periodically, officially, by federal personnel for regional maritime operations. Nothing flashy, no explosions, no helicopters, just serious, boring work that depends on one thing, unobstructed access. And there she was, blocking it with a trespassing sign. I walked closer, calm, because I've learned that matching this kind of energy only feeds it. "Marlene," I said, reading her name off the badge clipped to her blazer. "You can't put that sign there." She turned slowly, like a movie villain revealing themselves. Lips tight, eyes sharp, clipboard lifting instinctively like a shield. "This area is now restricted," she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Her HOA guidelines. That's when I felt it. That familiar HOA tension that isn't really about rules, but about control. She wasn't confused. She wasn't mistaken. She was asserting, "This dock is on my property," I said evenly, "and it's not under HOA jurisdiction." She scoffed. Actually scoffed like I just told her gravity was optional. "Well," she said, tapping her clipboard, "according to my documentation." I cut her off. "There's no documentation that gives you authority here," I said. "And more importantly, this dock serves an operational function. You're interfering with something you really don't want to interfere with." Her eyes widened for just a fraction of a second, long enough for doubt to flicker across her face. Then it disappeared. "No one is above the rules," she snapped, voice rising. "Not you, not anyone. This neighborhood has standards." That's when the arms started flying, big, theatrical gestures, pointing at imaginary boundaries, quoting rules that didn't apply, repeating phrases like community safety without ever explaining what danger she thought a piece of wood over water posed. People started filming. Phones came out slowly. Then all at once, you could feel the shift. This wasn't a disagreement anymore. It was a show. I warned her again. "Marlene, you're trespassing," I said. "And if someone needs access to this dock and can't get it because of your sign, that's on you." She laughed. Short, sharp. "Who exactly do you think is coming here?" she asked. I didn't answer, because right on cue, the water behind her rippled differently. A vessel was approaching. Steady, official, unmistakable if you knew what to look for. It eased toward the dock like it had dozens of times before, engines low and controlled. The moment stretched. Marlene didn't notice at first. She was too busy explaining her authority to a neighbor who clearly didn't buy it. But when she finally turned and saw the boat, the uniformed personnel stepping off, the insignia catching the sunlight, her face drained of color, somehow she still doubled down. She stepped forward, clipboard out, smile forced, launching straight back into her speech, explaining HOA restrictions to people who very clearly did not answer to her. And that's when I realized this wasn't about a sign anymore. This was about control running headfirst into reality. And reality doesn't negotiate. All right, pause the story here for a moment, because this is where a lot of people watching ask, how did she think she could get away with that? And the answer isn't just that she's crazy. By standard procedure, an HOA only has authority over what's clearly defined in its governing documents, plats, maps, covenants, and bylaws. If a piece of property isn't included in that framework, then the HOA has exactly zero authority over it. Not partial authority. Not temporary authority. Zero. They can't post signs. They can't limit access. And they absolutely can't invent rules on the fly just because something feels like it should belong to them. Legally speaking, what Marlene did crossed several lines at once. Putting signage on private property without permission is trespassing. Interfering with a designated operational access point, especially one tied to federal or emergency use, is a far more serious issue. That's the kind of mistake that turns a loud neighborhood argument into an official incident very quickly. But here's where it gets more interesting. This wasn't just a legal failure. It was a psychological one. This is a trap a lot of HOA enforcers fall into. They confuse proximity with authority. They see something near the neighborhood, something visible, something they don't personally control, and their mind fills in the blank with imagined power. The clipboard becomes a comfort object. The rules turn into a personality. And once someone like that commits publicly, mounts a sign, lectures the neighbors, performs authority, backing down feels like humiliation, and so instead of reassessing, they escalate. Louder voice, bigger gestures, more confident nonsense. That's why she didn't stop when warned. That's why she doubled down when she saw the boat. Because to her, admitting she was wrong would have meant admitting she was never in charge to begin with. And people like Marlene will risk everything to avoid that realization. The boat didn't rush in. That's the part people usually imagine wrong. No sirens, no shouting, just a slow, deliberate approach, like it didn't need to prove anything. Water rolled softly against the posts. The engine eased down, smooth and practiced. Two uniformed officers stepped onto the dock, and for a brief second, the entire scene went quiet. You could almost hear Marlene's thoughts scrambling, try to rewrite the script fast enough that she could still be the hero. She straightened her blazer, tightened her grip on the clipboard, forced a smile that never reached her eyes, and marched forward like this was still her stage. "Excuse me," she said, sharp but rehearsed. "This area is currently restricted due HOA enforcement actions." One of the officers raised a hand, not aggressively, just calmly, the universal signal of someone used to being obeyed. "Ma'am," he said, "whose sign is that?" Marlene blinked once. "I authorized it," she replied quickly with pride. "Under community guidelines." The officer nodded slowly, then scanned the dock, the sign, the screws, the placement. You could tell he was cataloging everything without writing a word. "And whose property is this?" he asked. She hesitated, just a fraction too long. "Well," she said, her voice tightening, "it's adjacent to HOA land and therefore subject to—" The second officer stepped in. "Ma'am," she said, firm but polite, "this dock is not under HOA jurisdiction. It is privately owned and serves as a designated access point. You are not authorized to place signage here." That's when the color drained completely from Marlene's face. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. She tried to laugh it off. That brittle laugh people make when they realize the ground beneath them isn't solid. "There must be some mistake," she said, waving the clipboard like it could save her. "I have documentation." "May I see it?" the officer asked. Marlene flipped through the pages too fast. Papers rustled. Fingers fumbled. She pointed to highlighted sections that had nothing to do with the dock, the water, or reality itself. The officer glanced once, then handed it back. "This doesn't apply," she said. And just like that, the performance collapsed. Marlene's voice rose, no longer confident, shrill, defensive. She talked faster, explaining intent, explaining concerns, explaining that she was just doing her job, insisting someone should have told her. That's when the first officer said the sentence that broke her. "Ma'am, by posting this sign and restricting access, you interfere with operational zone." The word interfered landed heavy. If personnel had been denied access when needed, this would have escalated beyond a warning. Phones were still recording. Neighbors weren't hiding it anymore. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another laughed quietly. Marlene noticed. Her shoulders tightened. Her eyes darted around. She finally realized this wasn't a private misunderstanding she could smooth over later. This was public, documented. Witness, her protests unraveled. She contradicted herself, claiming she was instructed to do this, then claiming she wasn't instructed at all, then insisting she was only trying to help. The clipboard lowered. The authority drained from her voice sentence by sentence. The officers took notes, names, times, actions, then told her to remove the sign. Immediately, she hesitated one last stubborn second, standing there like a child daring an adult to blink first. Then she reached for the sign. The screws squealed as she backed them out, hands shaking just enough to notice. When the sign came free, she held it awkwardly, like she didn't know what to do with it now that it wasn't a weapon. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She just walked away, clipboard under her arm, sign pressed to her side, back stiff, head down. The crowd parted without a word. The officers turned to me, confirmed what they already knew, thanked me for the heads up, and within minutes they were gone. The boat eased away like nothing unusual had happened at all. But the damage was done. The video spread fast. Group chats, neighborhood forums, private messages from people who'd been on the receiving end of Marlene's authority for years. Everyone suddenly had a story. Everyone suddenly felt validated. By that evening, it had a nickname, the dock incident. Some people called it worse. Later that night, I walked back down to the dock with my family. The water was calm. The sign was gone. Everything exactly as it should be. My daughter leaned over the edge, then looked back at me. "She really thought she could stop them?" she asked. I smiled. "Yeah," I said. And she keeps learning the hard way that she can't. Because that's the thing about people like Marlene. They don't lose because someone yells louder. They lose because reality eventually shows up, calm, official, and completely uninterested in their imaginary power. And when it does, there's no clipboard big enough to stop it. What stuck with me afterward wasn't the sign or the clipboard, or even the fact that a boat full of uniformed professionals had to explain basic reality to a grown adult. It was how familiar the pattern felt. Because if you've ever lived under an HOA, you know this was never really about a dock. It never is. The lesson is that HOA conflicts almost never start with rules. They start with identity. Someone get a little authority, a little validation, maybe a title that sounds official enough, and slowly that role becomes who they are. Enforcing rules stops being a responsibility and starts being a source of self-worth. And that's dangerous, because once authority becomes personal, logic becomes optional. Boundaries blur. I think quietly replaces, I know. And suddenly someone feels justified telling other adults where they can stand, what they can touch, and what they're allowed to use, even when the law says otherwise. Legally, this story has a clean ending. Jurisdiction matters. Property lines matter. Documentation matters. Authority doesn't come from confidence, volume, or laminated paperwork. It comes from whether it actually exists. But humanly, it's Messier. Marlene didn't wake up that morning planning to be publicly humiliated. She woke up convinced she was doing the right thing, convinced that control meant order, order meant safety, and safety justified everything that followed. That's how these situations escalate. Not because someone is evil, but because they fall into a trap where backing down feels like erasing themselves, where admitting I was wrong feels worse than doubling down, where saving face matters more than avoiding real consequences. And the irony is that the harder someone tries to force authority they don't have, the faster they lose the respect they could have earned. If you live in an HOA, here's the real takeaway. Know your documents. Not emotionally, not selectively. Actually know them. Know where HOA authority starts, where it ends, and what's explicitly excluded. Because ignorance doesn't just hurt homeowners. It hurts the people enforcing the rules, too. And if you serve on a board or help with enforcement, ask yourself one uncomfortable question. Am I protecting the community, or am I protecting my sense of control? Because the moment those get confused, reality will step in eventually. And as we've established, reality doesn't negotiate. What saved the situation wasn't yelling, threats, or legal posturing. It was patience, documentation, and letting the correct authority handle it. That's not flashy. It doesn't feel satisfying in the moment, but it works. And finally, I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with someone who confused confidence with authority? Someone who enforced rules they didn't understand in places they didn't control because no one had challenged them yet? Drop your story in the comments. I read them. A lot of us do. And if nothing else, maybe sharing them reminds people that power without limits always collapses under its own weight. Signs can be removed. Clipboards can be dropped. But the truth always docks eventually.